Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at this fascinating conference. Very strange to be an outsider at such an intense celebration of one topic. This is my topic. I'm going to talk about healing and marketing and put architecture in the context of a very broad city narrative. I'm going to start with boasting about Glasgow, which is in my contract. And in the kind of terms that you hear from cities competing for international tourism. Bilbao is a famous example. And while none of the boasting that I will do is untrue, I'd like to then look underneath the narrative and explore the role of cultural institutions in cities today. I'm going to pick up a lot of the themes of yesterday, storytelling, tangible and intangible heritage, and to do that, I feel I have to do the history of Glasgow, so I'm going to spend about 10 minutes doing 1,300 years of the history of Glasgow and look at the serious issues of poverty and inequality, which usually don't appear in tourist narratives. And then I'm going to take about 20-25 minutes to look at how cultural institutions, in particular museums, in the context of modernism as well, respond to this history and current problems. My main argument is that cultural institutions and city marketing have important roles beyond economic regeneration and have a major contribution to ensuring that our cities are healthy places to live. So first of all, in case you're not sure where we are, a bit of geography. We're on the west coast of Scotland, about 1,500 kilometres north of here. Glasgow has a population of about 600,000 people in a conurbation of 1.7 million. We're located on the River Clyde, the main consequence of which is that we have access to the Atlantic, and also we have a lot of weather. We say locally that we have not 4 seasons, but 2, June and winter. And so on to the boasting. Glasgow was European City of Culture in 1990. At the end of this list, and a lot of people thought Glasgow was surprising. Melina Mercouri, who founded the European City of Culture, was shocked and voted against us becoming City of Culture. So Glasgow is credited with having a successful year of culture, having used it to rebrand the city, and is also credited with changing it from being an accolade for already cultural cities to turning the title into an instrument of regeneration. Today, despite our location and our weather, Glasgow is now the 5th most visited tourist city in Britain. We get about 2 million tourist visits each year. 600,000 or 700,000 of those are cultural tourists, and this reflects the city's rich cultural life. Glasgow is home to 4 of the 5 national performing arts companies. We have the National Opera, National Ballet, National Theatre, and 2 producing theatres. Glasgow has more live music performances than any other UK city outside London, even more than Manchester, which is the famous UK music city. Now that's one of the reasons why we're a UK city of music. We also have 2 symphony orchestras and lots of commercial music for young people. Our arena, which is new, was the 3rd busiest music venue in the world since it opened in 2012. We have the most visited civic museums in Britain. 2 of our museums get more than 1 million visits a year each, and I'll be saying a bit more about those. You might recognize the work of a Spanish artist, our most famous painting by Salvador Dalí on the top right, and that's one of our Rembrandts. It's a city of great music festivals. Celtic Connections is the biggest festival in Scotland outside the Edinburgh Festival. And Glasgow has a growing reputation for contemporary art. Glasgow has won more Turner Prizes, Glasgow artists, than any other UK city. And one critic has described the flowering of creativity in Glasgow as the Glasgow miracle. And this is where I want to change the narrative. Glasgow artists hate the term the Glasgow miracle because it implies that it came out of nothing. In fact, it came out of incredible work over decades, the teachers in the School of Art, millions invested by the city in facilities for artists, and of course the hard work of artists themselves. So I'd now like to go back and do a quick run through the history of Glasgow. Glasgow's medieval city began as a settlement, Christian settlement in the 7th century. Here you can see the medieval cathedral and a medieval house, which is one of our museums. In the 18th century, Glasgow became immensely wealthy, importing tobacco from slave plantations in the Americas, and was considered to be as beautiful a city as Bath. The Victorian industrial boom swept most of the 18th century city away. Glasgow's industrial expansion was the fastest in the world until the Soviet expansion in the 1920s. In 1913, 2/3 of the shipping tonnage in the world was built in Glasgow. By 1914, Glasgow was the 5th biggest city in Europe after London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. Sorry, that's 6th. Yes, 6th. This is the Queen Mary, a famous Glasgow ship now preserved in Los Angeles. Yes, this one. Architecturally, Glasgow is much more a Northern European or North Atlantic city, has much more in common with Boston or Copenhagen than with any English city. And these 4-story apartment blocks are very characteristic, called tenements in Glasgow, and they catered for all classes, including the very wealthy. And Glasgow was one of the richest cities in Europe, one of the richest cities in the British Empire. Just to give you an idea of some of the, I suppose, the backward-looking buildings, the one on the left is a carpet factory inspired by the Doge's Palace in Venice. The one on the right is one of the earliest cast iron buildings from 1855. The wealth and the art market created a number of schools, artistic schools. The Glasgow Boys was one, about 25, 26 artists who painted about the dignity of rural poverty, the incredibly dignified farmer, and this cheerful painting of a child's funeral in the Highlands. They also, as well as the rural idylls they also painted about the pleasures of bourgeois life. More famously, the Glasgow style, Glasgow's variant of Art Nouveau, flowered, and these are works by Margaret MacDonald, and of course Charles Rennie Mackintosh is the great leader of this movement, his School of Art of 1896 and one of his many tea rooms. Alongside this great wealth was incredible poverty. These are photographs commissioned by the city in the 1860s as part of a slum clearance movement. As well as being known as the workshop of the empire, it was also known as the cancer of empire. This provoked a radical political response. This is the red flag being raised in George Square in 1919 and the tanks sent in by Winston Churchill to stop the revolution. But the Victorian elite did believe in trying to address social problems. They built a whole range of cultural and leisure institutions, including the first civic art gallery in the UK, People's Palace Museum, more parks per square person than any other city in the UK, and dozens of libraries. What is interesting about this historically is that the city corporation was explicit in linking culture and health. And just for the translator, I'll read this out. Is it possible for any public body to deal effectively with the institutions and conditions of life so apparently so widely removed as public health and municipal art? These two extremes not only do but must meet and blend together to their mutual advantage. Much of this was inspired by Ruskin. The European City of Culture also has its precedents in huge industrial exhibitions. This was one from 1901, attended by 11 million people. You can see Kelvin Grove Art Gallery in the centre and the university on the right. During the Second World War, Glasgow was a major centre for armaments production, ships and locomotives for the war effort, and as you can see here, we're still celebrating Victorian technology. This is a steam engine in 1951 when other countries had shifted to diesel and electric. So far from returning to prosperity, the post-war period brought the de-industrial revolution and nearly destroyed the city. The collapse of the iron, steel and coal economy between 1960 and 1980s had a catastrophic effect on the city. It lost nearly half its population, and the Scottish government assumed that the task of the council was to manage decline. They advised businesses not to move there. and 25% of the adult population was unemployed. London newspapers said things like, Glasgow was worse than East Berlin, Glasgow has no vision in the face of urban devastation. At the same time, the national Labour government and the local city Labour government set about demolishing the Victorian slums to build new housing for the masses of the people. They also redesigned the city for the car. This is the city centre, and you can see the motorway that cuts right through and across, demolishing thousands of buildings. People were rehoused in these high flats. Glasgow built more buildings, over 10 stories, than any other city in Western Europe per head of population. The buildings on the top right, the Red Road flats, which I'll come back to, were the tallest residential buildings in Europe when they were built. 200,000 people were moved, forcibly relocated to the tower blocks or to new towns. This is one of the new towns. But that wasn't the whole of the plan. This was going to be the new city centre. They were going to demolish all of this, including buildings with these interiors, and this was going to be the new town hall. Luckily, they ran out of money. So all of this sense that the city was going to die led to a reaction, and the local leadership, captured in the title of this book, 1988 book, The City That Refused to Die. Glasgow started with city marketing, the Glasgow Smiles Better campaign, which a lot of local people were sceptical about. The local piece of graffiti was Glasgow Smiles Better than the Black Hole of Calcutta. And eventually the city bid for and won, as I said, the European City of Culture. The point of the Glasgow Smiles Better campaign was to boost local confidence as well as to promote the city to tourists. So the other big initiative in 1983, the Glasgow Smiles Better campaign, they also opened the Burrell Collection, which is one of Scotland's greatest modernist buildings and now has the highest category of heritage preservation. It's an A-listed building. The building was also important for the Basque Country. A delegation from Bilbao visited Glasgow in 1991 and saw the Burrell Collection, saw the impact of culture. So this became one of the inspirations for the Guggenheim. Burrell Collection, very eclectic. You can see great medieval art, great classical Roman art. You can see a Degas and a Rodin, lots of Chinese objects. And one of the great joys of the building is the way the outside and the park outside and the interior are linked. So that's the story. In some ways, the public story is about how stylish Glasgow is, how it's, according to the Lonely Planet Guide in 2009, Glasgow is one of the top 10 places in the world to visit. However, this is only part of the story. This is a real newspaper headline, Glasgow is City of the Damned, which refers to the city's health statistics. About 30% of the population live in poverty, and the life expectancy difference between the best off and worst off for men is 16 years, and that difference is getting worse. 80% of that health difference and life expectancy difference can be explained by poverty, but 20% of it can't. So cities like Manchester and Liverpool, which have similar deprivation, people live longer. And this has been a mystery for years. It's called the Glasgow effect. The most convincing recent explanation by academics is that when the Labour and modernist planning moved people, they moved the better off, the upper working class, to the new towns, and they moved the poorest people to the tower blocks. So they concentrated poverty in a particular area, destroying community and aspiration. So how do we respond? How do cultural institutions respond? And what is the architectural response? I'd like to start with some recent evidence that the Victorian intuition that museums contribute to public health turns out to be correct. Since 1996, there have been about 20 epidemiological studies like this one, which show that visiting museums and the cinema and going to live music regularly have such an impact that people live longer as a result. These studies involve large numbers of people living over many years, and are controlled for gender, smoking, which is a big problem in Glasgow, economic status, education, and chronic illness. This is not people taking part in art therapy or even doing workshops in the museum. It's simply going to concerts, museums, or the cinema. The evidence is accumulating that cultural attendance has a separate causal influence and is not just a reflection of other variables. It's not that healthy people visit museums more often, but visiting museums make you healthy. And I think we're approaching the time when cultural attendance will be like physical exercise. It'll be accepted as a health benefit, but like a health benefit, it has to be kept up for you to feel the benefit. If we take this research seriously, then creating inclusive museums which attract people with the worst health is very important. It becomes more an issue than an issue of cultural rights. It's also a question of survival. And I'd now like to look at 3 museum projects which have sought radically to improve inclusion and to work with architecture to make it part of an inclusive process. So this is Kelvin Grove, the city's main museum, opened in 1901. By the 1990s, it was in bad need of restoration and modernization, both in terms of displays and of services. It hadn't been rewired since 1899. It was, however, extremely popular. It was the most visited museum in the UK outside London, and of local visitors, 40% were working class. So there's a strong tradition of working class museum visiting in Glasgow. And actually, the biggest challenge was not to exclude them when we refurbished, not to gentrify the museum. In order to ensure that we retained this audience and attracted new local visitors, we carried out the most extensive range of visitor studies ever carried out in a cultural museum in Britain up to that point. We used surveys and focus groups. We had an education advisory panel, a community forum, a disability advisory panel, and a junior friends group. We asked people about their favourite objects, their prior knowledge, their interests, their learning preferences for new subjects, and their social patterns, who they visited with. We carried out a building usage survey. We discovered that 80% of people never went upstairs, so they missed half the collection. So just to give you a quick idea of some of the new galleries, a Glasgow Boys Gallery, Dutch paintings, Rembrandt there, and Scottish Natural History Gallery. You can see it's a classic Victorian encyclopedic museum, a gallery about warfare and violence. We tell some of the stories of Scottish soldiers in the British Empire and how some of the collection is the loot of war. This is a story about the Holocaust, a survivor who moved to Scotland. And of course, a gallery for Charles Rennie Mackintosh. The refurbishment was very successful. We reopened in 2006 and had 3.2 million visits in year one. More than 50% of the city's population visited an average of 4 times in the year after we opened, and 40% of that increased number came from the working class community. We got some very good reviews like this one. Can you just interpret that for? And we got some less good ones, some of which got quite personal, but it's good to know who your enemies are. What was interesting about the Burlington magazine, which is the leading art magazine in Britain, the lowest common denominator wasn't an attack on the curators, it was an attack on our visitors. The people in the museum are not good enough to be there, is what they were saying. And this was because we didn't limit the museum to the middle class art lovers, for better off, better educated people, because actually the citizens own this museum, it belongs to everybody. Part of the project was to move our stores, so we built a new store with over 1 million objects. And again, the simple principle, people own this stuff, so they have a right to see it without booking, without being vetted, so there are behind-the-scenes tours every day. This is a school group doing a workshop called A Day at the Beach, given our need for sunshine. This is an important subject, inspired by one of the paintings in store. So the next project is the Riverside Museum, designed by the late Zaha Hadid, which opened in 2011. Much of Glasgow's industry had been based on the Clyde. At one stage, there were over 140 shipyards during the 19th century. This is the site of the museum, which by the 1980s was just a scar in the city, a gaping wound, rather than a source of life and connection. You can just see on the top right-hand corner is Kelvin Grove, and if you're in there, there's no sense that the river is anywhere near. The city turned its back on the river. So in some ways, the Riverside is a classic riverside regeneration project, a shiny shed with an expensive roof. But what's unusual about the museum is that it doesn't have contemporary art. It has local history. The city decided to move the Museum of Transport, which was very popular, so that the shiny exterior had local content. As you can see, this is the exterior, and we won the European Museum of the Year award in 2013. Again, my contract obliges me to mention this at least twice in every speech. But we took the visitor engagement strategies in Kelvin Grove to a new level. We had a similar range of visitor and non-visitor research. We had academic, education, teenager, community, and junior children advisory panels, much of it led by my colleague Susie Ironside, who's going to speak to you later. The panels had over 200 members, and there are quotes from interviews with over 400 different individuals in the display interpretation. So the people of the city tell their own stories in the museum. We made it relevant by addressing non-traditional subjects, skateboarding as a way of travel. Glasgow has produced British and world skateboarding champions. And we also looked at motorbike and car road traffic accidents. We brought in lots of different collections. You can see costume on the right, and on the left in the display about the 60s, the Mini Cooper. That's a Bridget Riley, one of Britain's most famous contemporary artists. The space for children to learn through imaginative play, disabled access is of the highest standard throughout the building. It's an unusual museum in that there is no temporary exhibition space. It relies on small changes in displays and events to attract visitors. This was a roller conga. I don't know if you've ever taken part in a roller conga. And this is every summer or every June, we have a beach. And again, the beach theme continues. These are some of the stories that we changed. On the left is one about people from South Asia, India and Pakistan who moved to Glasgow in the 1960s to work on driving the buses. And on the right is a story about wheelchairs in World War I. So again, people, first person, telling the story of the city, of experiences of living in the city. All our museums are free, but even with them being free, poor people in poor parts of the city find transport expensive, and they find it difficult to buy things in the cafe. Their children want to eat. It's expensive. So we provide picnic areas in the museum and encourage people to bring their own food. That's the museum on the right. Across the river is Govan, which is one of the poorest parts of Britain. And we hope that one day there will be a bridge. But in the meantime, we have used some of the museum's education budget to fund a ferry across the river every summer, which means that 17,000 people who would never otherwise have got to the museum are able to visit. So on to my third project. I'm doing okay for time. The city public housing is now managed by independent housing associations, and they're in the process of demolishing many of these tower blocks and replacing them with low-rise housing, which people prefer. So the demolition of the when I moved to Glasgow first, I lived on the 23rd floor of this tower block for a year. Very frightening place. We worked with the local housing association to develop a project because even though people wanted this change, even positive change can be very traumatic. It involves a loss of meaning and identity, I often think it's like getting married. It's a great future, but you'll leave a lot of stuff behind, some of which you quite liked. But this is quite an old book, 1974, but it captures that sense that planning is done to people, and even if they agree to it, it can be very traumatic. So we developed a project to capture people's memories. 3 generations of people had lived in these buildings. We did group work in the area. We solicited memories online, and these memories were used as the basis. We commissioned a novelist to write a story based on all of these memories. We worked with a photography organization who worked with people to take photographs. We created a gallery in one of the empty apartments in the tower block. We commissioned an artist to do these sort of psychogeography drawings of people's memories. So this is one family and all their memories of their apartment and what happened all around it. And these are now in the museum. And the culmination of this project was an exhibition in the People's Palace, the city's main local history museum, which recognized the history of the people who had lived in these buildings since the late 1960s, but was also marking it for the city. Buildings higher than the pyramids of Egypt had been wiped off the landscape, and there was no trace of them was going to be left. And we thought it was really important to register this. When the next set of high-rise apartments was being demolished, we also worked with the Housing Association and asked people, did they want to do a memory project? And they said no, which is one of the problems with community consultation. People say no to what you thought they would like. We worked with 2 artists who did an elaborate process of consultation with them, and what they were really worried about was the process of being moved from house to house in an area where there was going to be 5 years of demolition. And what they wanted was a garden, but because of the demolition, it couldn't be in one place, so the artists designed a mobile garden that could follow people around, and that process is now built into the master plan. For the first time, the art process is built into master planning a city neighborhood, and all of that will lead to the final design of the green space in the new low-rise neighborhood that is going to be built. So that was the 3 museum projects engagement with participation that I wanted to talk about. I want to say a bit more about city marketing before we finish, again on the subject of storytelling and participation. The Glasgow Smiles Better slogan was very popular, but in the way of marketing people, they like new things, so the city slogan was changed a number of times, and then from 2004 we had Glasgow, Scotland with Style. This was meant to refer to Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Glasgow with Style. A lot of people thought it was shallow, Edinburgh, Scotland with content. But it quickly became a shopping brand. In the consumerist boom of before the crash of 2008, it was very much focused on shopping. Glasgow has the best shopping in Britain outside London, and the City Marketing Bureau thought we could sell this. But as you can see from this Guardian headline, it says, as the wealth and health gaps widen, Glasgow rebrands itself as a city of style. This created a really strong cognitive dissonance between the reality and the marketing, and for cultural institutions, this was not what we wanted to represent us. So in 2013, we hosted the Commonwealth Games in 2014. You wouldn't have been involved in this. And we developed the first ever crowdsourced brand in Britain. People Make Glasgow. We asked people from Glasgow and Glaswegians from all over the world online what they thought the best quality of the city was, and they said it was the people. Glasgow people think of themselves as friendly. This is not just a local delusion, although sometimes they get a bit too friendly. Lots of surveys say that it is an extremely friendly city. So the brand feels authentic for local people as well as for tourists, and it can also be used for social messages. So the People Make Glasgow Fairer campaign was a campaign to reduce the stigma of poverty. The tabloid media attack poor people and represent them as parasites, and this was a campaign to reduce that stigma. Despite the demolitions, we still have an amazing architectural legacy, according to the great English architectural historian Andor Gom. Glasgow has the world's richest concentration of Victorian architecture. And in case you think we're demolishing all our 20th century buildings, about 40 post-war structures have heritage status, including a number have A-listed status. And not just buildings, but structures like this sculpture. This is a statue of La Pasionaria, a reference to Glasgow's radical past and the number of Glaswegians who fought on the right side in the Spanish Civil War. And our next major project is the refurbishment of the Burrell collection. Like a lot of modernist buildings, the flat roof was an interesting experiment, but not in the north of Europe where we are. It opened in 1983, it leaked in the winter of 1983 and has leaked ever since. I'm not going to say much about the process of engagement around this because my colleague Susie Ironside is going to speak to you later this morning. We've had very interesting discussions with the 20th Century Society about changing this building. They want it to be treated with as much respect as a Renaissance palace, and we say yes. Have you seen what people do to Renaissance palaces to give them a new use? So it's been very interesting, and this is going to be one of the biggest refurbishments of a 20th century A-listed buildings in Britain. So to conclude, cities are now where most people live. They're at the heart of civilization, where the creative energy of humanity is concentrated. They're also the sites of great inequality and of environments which are inimical to human flourishing. My argument this morning has been that cultural institutions like museums have much more to offer than physical or economic regeneration, more even than cultural experiences. They can offer rich sources of meaning, of hope, and of human connection in a way that not just metaphorically, but in reality, can contribute to healing the wounded city. Thank you very much.